Hi, guys. Welcome back to a new episode for Real Struggles, Real Hope. Adoption is a topic that is very close to God's heart. And in this episode, I will be interviewing my dear friend Karen Springs. She's an advocate for orphans and has helped many families to adopt children. If you are interested in adoption, if you would like to adopt, or if you would like to support families that have adopted, then this interview will be full of practical insights and wisdom about adoption. Hi, Karen.
Hi, Hannah.
Thank you so much for taking the time. I'm so excited that to have you here today.
Thank you.
Karen, you have been an amazing advocate for orphans, and also you really have given a voice to families who adopted. And I would just love it if you could share a little bit with us. How did that happen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I always say I kind of like it was an accidental calling, which I say humorously, but when I graduated from university in 2004, I knew that I had relatives that were living in Ukraine, and they had extended an invitation for me to come over and do a year-long internship to see their ministry. And I'd always dreamed of traveling the world. So I just kind of saw it as an open door to go. And they were working with a media ministry that also had a humanitarian arm attached to that. So I went over for what was supposed to be 8 months to serve with their family in Ukraine. And when I got there, I initially thought, what am I doing here? I don't speak Russian or Ukrainian. I'm young. Like, what do I have to offer? And I had the opportunity within like a month of being in Ukraine to go on a humanitarian aid distribution to an orphanage in southern Ukraine, because the ministry that my family was running did aid distribution throughout the country was one of the things that they were doing. So I went on this aid distribution, and my uncle who ran the ministry had said, well, why don't you just interview the orphanage director? You can, get some information so that we can write, to our supporters about what we're doing, that kind of thing. So they sent a translator with me on this trip. And when I went down, it was there that was my first time in a very large scale orphanage before. And so while I was there, I met this group of 11, 12-year-old girls, and with my translator that was with me, got to interact with them. But I think God really touched my heart that weekend. It broke my heart, I should say, seeing the reality of these little girls that didn't have a mom or dad to tuck them in at night. And I think that was just what struck me, is I could so remember being that age and always having a close relationship with my parents, and to think like, what would that have been like to not have like a caring adult, one person, not just to be like a member of a group. So after that weekend, I just felt like this impassioned advocate of that I needed to advocate for these kids to have homes, because I think traditionally we'd always thought of adoption as like little children, going into families, and this age group of preteens and teenagers we hadn't really considered. So, my relatives that I was living with at the time, they were also in the process of adoption, of a child. And so they were impassioned about the topic. I became impassioned about the topic. And that really set me on the trajectory to become an advocate for adoption. And then within the ministry, several projects grew from there, to promote adoption, and then also to work with kids who would be aging out of the orphanage system and how to prepare them for independent living. So what was supposed to be an 8-month trip quickly began to snowball as I was paired with 2 other women in our office who also had a similar heart for adoption advocacy, and to see kids go into Ukrainian families. And so I became a part of this team. All these projects were starting. And then my 8 months were drawing to a close. And I just thought, like, why am I going home? God is doing so much in this nation. And I felt like he was extending an opportunity to be a part of it. So I did go home for a short season. I studied Russian, and then I returned back to Ukraine to kind of dive back in where I'd left off. And it led to almost 15 years of living in Ukraine. So God definitely changed my 8-month plan.
Yeah, that's amazing. And so about 2 years ago, you felt, it was time to move on, and you left the Ukraine, you moved back to America. But before you did that, you went on a road trip, and you had an amazing project in mind. You wrote a book. I think now it's the other way around in the camera.
I see it the correct way.
Okay.
Yeah, I do.
So this is how it looks like. And basically it's called Adoption Through the Rearview Mirror. And, when I picked up this book, I wasn't quite sure what to expect. And I have read quite a few books on adoption, and very often they talk about, how to bring the child home and how to bond with the child and all that. But actually, what is so unique about your book is that you interviewed families who had adopted children, and years later you went back and you just sat in their living room and asked them the hard questions, how it really went for them, and how the journey of adoption and having the kids live with them, how it all played out. And I would just love for you to tell us a little bit, what was your motivation for that? And what did you find when you interviewed the families? And I know that's like a big question because you wrote a whole book on it, but maybe, what motivated you to do that?
Yeah. So I guess one piece to include in that. So about 10. So I'd been living in Ukraine for, I guess, 6 years. Yeah. So I'm trying to think of like my timeline, 6 years. And then that was when God really put on my heart to do more for adoptive families. And so I prayed about like what I could do. And I had always had a heart for hospitality. And so God opened up the door for me to get an apartment in downtown Kiev where I could help families that were adopting. So what I did was I opened up my home and I just started advertising that I had a free bedroom that people could come and stay in while they were adopting. So I called it Hospitality House Kiev, and I had a blog that promoted it. And then word just spread, word of mouth. So this was primarily American families that were coming over to Ukraine. So part of our ministry was promoting adoption in Ukraine among nationals. And then I was just reaching out to foreign families that were coming over to adopt children. So in the course of the years went by. So I ran this hospitality ministry for about 6-7 years, where I literally just had a revolving door of adoptive couples coming in on the front end or the back end of their adoption process, because they would travel to like the region where the child was for the middle. And so I hosted over 150 families in my home over these 6-7 years. And as time went by, right, you see a little bit of the naivety, rose-colored glasses of like, we just need to get these children home and all will be well. And I would keep in touch with some of these families, and I would see the challenges that they were facing. And so I got to this place where after I'd been doing this for a couple of years, it felt, I struggled with like what to say, because I would be very aware of families that were home in the United States struggling with behavioral issues, transition issues, attachment issues, all the things that we can think of. And then I'd see these new families coming over, just ready to hit the ground running. And they'd ask you like, oh, well, how are the families doing? The other families that you posted, like, how are they doing now? And then part of you is like, well, how much do I say? Because you don't want to be the person that like puts the damper on their joy parade. And so you always kind of like tempered things that you would say, so as to not like make people afraid. But at the same time, you also wanted to speak to truth. So fast forward, I just decided, I had this idea. I had this large map up on the wall of my apartment where I had pinned the locations where all these families were from. And one person had said to me, like, you've experienced so many things, you've been to so many places and met so many families, you should write a book someday. So that was like the seed that was planted, where I was like, oh, that'd be an interesting idea. And so, so really, I felt like that was like kind of the dream that was maybe put inside me. And then after time went by, I just thought, yeah, I'm gonna do this thing. Like, no time but now. I just felt like enough time had gone by where I could reach out to these families. So I sent out an email to, at least 50 or 60 families that had stayed with me and just said, what would you think if I showed up at your house and interviewed you to get the full spectrum of like what happens after you go home? Mm-hmm. And the response was like overwhelming of like, we would love to be a part of that. We have so many things that we would, want to caution other families about, or things that we've learned, mistakes we've made. So the response was overwhelming. So I was like, okay, I think I've tapped into something here. And so, I raised all the funds so that I could take time off work and spend 4 months on the road traveling across the US. And so, yeah, as you said, I interviewed around 60 some families and stayed with most of them in their home as well. So I would come and stay with them for 2 to 3 days, would conduct like a 2 to 3 hour interview where, some of the questions just were birthed from what I had witnessed of seeing where struggles were. And I knew that my goal in the project was not to tell fairy tale versions of adoption and how wonderful it was, and to see all the miracle things of like how families raise the money to bring home children. I knew that I wanted to deal with the harder side of adoption. So my questions definitely went straight to the things that were challenging. And I had kind of pre-identified some themes that I had seen in adoption over the years. And so I kind of crafted my questions under those themes. And then as I was doing that, other themes arose as well of just common struggles, common issues, common feelings that I saw, throughout different families. And so that was then how I organized the book, was what were the issues that families struggled with. And then just allowed stories to come through to illustrate that, so that families could see that they weren't alone in what they had experienced. And they could see that other families were going through the same things, and that they could hopefully learn from one another and be encouraged that they were on their own.
Yeah. And also, you kept it all anonymous. You changed the names. And I think that really gave the families the freedom to just be so raw and honest and really answer the hard question. Because actually, while I was kind of preparing for this interview beforehand, I kind of had brainstormed the different topics that I want to do. And when it came to adoption, I was actually thinking about interviewing some of my friends who adopted. Mm-hmm. But then I realized, okay, that probably wouldn't be appropriate because they're still raising these children. And then you don't want to go on camera, publicly and then talk about your struggles. But then at the same time, I really felt, okay, there needs to be a platform where people can get information about it, if they want to adopt. And as you said, often, we have this fairy tale thinking, oh, we just bring home the sweet child, baby, or maybe an older child, and then we will live happily ever after. But actually, there's so much in between, and it's such a big, transition for the child. But also, this child has come with a lot of trauma often, and adoption always starts with a loss because the biological parents of that child could not or would not raise it, and so there's a lot of rejection, abandonment issues. And I think it's sometimes really hard for adoptive families to kind of weed through all of that. And then they bring the child home and all of a sudden, there are all the problems, but you feel like, oh, we're the only ones, did we not hear from the Lord correctly? Or what are we doing wrong? And that's why I think your book is so valuable, because it really, it kind of opens the platform where people can start the discussion and also see, okay, we're not alone. Other families walked through this. Mm-hmm. And so I just want to read a quote from your book that one of the dads said. And he said, my friend helped me remember that love is not a feeling. When we act against what we feel and choose love, that is really love. Mm-hmm. And that really spoke to me, because I've spoken to, a couple of my friends who adopted, and they often struggle with, oh, I don't feel love for that child because maybe the child's behavior, is not very nice towards the parents. And so they're really kind of wrestling with that they don't have the feeling. But actually, I said to them, I think what you've done shows love because you took that child into your family and you're laying your life down in a way, even though it's hard, but you really give the family, the child what the child needs. And so how did you see that play out? That families they brought the child home, but then they realized it's hard. But what helped them to keep going? If they didn't have the feeling of love, but how did true love play out? Because true love often it's an action. It's not a feeling.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that was a big thing that quote that you just read, I think there was a lot of similar quotes like that by both men and women that I interviewed. And I think, I don't know, I'm trying to think it's in John, right? Where Jesus says, who are you that if you love those who love you, right? Like what kind of good is that? Right. But if you love those, like if you love your enemies, like that's real love. And I always think about that because we can often all think of ourselves as like loving people. Like, I think I'm like, oh, I'm a really loving person. Like I love people until like a disagreeable person is in front of me, and then you're like, oh wait, I struggle to love. So then you realize like, oh, you're really not that great. You just love people that like are naturally like easier people to be around. And we kind of like can pat ourselves on the back because we think we're kind. But then I feel like God brings difficult people or challenging personalities into our lives to show us like that in our own love, like our own love is so limited and so fickle and changes, right? But true love, right? God's love, it goes beyond feelings. And so, transferring that into a child, a parent-child relationship, I think what's so challenging for families though, is like, everyone can struggle probably at moments to perhaps feel love even towards their biological children if they do something naughty, right? Or if they're in a season of rebellion, right? I'm sure there's moments where a parent doesn't like feel all the gushy, loving feelings toward that child in that moment. But the reality is because there's so much history and attachment, like the foundation of that love is there. So it's really easier to choose love in that moment. But like going back to bringing a child in that you don't have that history with, and you don't have that like attachment that formed when you were carrying that child in your womb, suddenly, it's a lot harder to go back to that foundational level. And I think families then would wrestle with a lot of feelings of guilt and shame because they weren't feeling that love. And so they'd think, well, what's wrong with me? I can love this other child in my home who's been with me, since he or she was born. So, there's something wrong with me because I'm not loving this child that I have adopted and is now my own child. So I think it can, especially when there's biological children and adopted children in the home, that seeing that stark contrast, I know was hard for a lot of people because they felt like it just highlighted their own preferences, But I think it's in those moments that God, like what you were telling your friend is like, that's when God can highlight, like, that's where you go the step farther of like, yeah, but this is what true love is to love when you don't feel the loving and the loving feelings and to make a choice to love anyway. Right. And I think it's kind of that, like, how do you get your emotions to follow your actions? And I wish it was like an easy formula to say that, like, once you start doing something, the feelings come. And sometimes they do. Like, I think sometimes feelings will come stronger, but for other people, it's just a choice, like a choice to show up and a choice to keep providing and loving in ways that maybe aren't what you would normally think. So I think it's a good reminder for families that are considering adoption to know, like, what would you do in that moment? Like, what do you do when there's hard people around you to love? And what is your natural response? Because I think you never know until you're in it, but I just think it's something to be aware of and prepared for.
What I loved about the families, what I've noticed, when I read the different stories, a lot of them then came to the point where they saw the struggles as an opportunity to become more like Christ. And I'm not quite sure if you were talking about that scripture, but I actually wrote down John 15:12-13, where it says, my command is this, love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. And I mean, that's what Jesus did for us on the cross when he died. Even though we were not lovable, we were still in our sins, he decided to die for us. And I kind of saw this pattern in those families that you interviewed, a lot of them who then made the decision, as you said, I don't feel it, but I decide to lay my life down for this child, even though it's uncomfortable. It brings tension to my family. And I just thought the attitude they had was so amazing, because they invited God into it. And with his help, they could overcome and work through things. And actually that made them more Christ-like. They let themselves be transformed into his image because they embraced the difficulties and they didn't push it away. Mm-hmm. And so I think that really stood out to me. It was amazing to see. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But then, of course, on the other hand, you talk about this in your book. You mentioned it briefly. It was, I think you called it adoption disruption. Is that the right term? Mm-hmm. And I also thought that was very brave to talk about this disruption. For those who don't know, it's the point where actually the child then is placed in a different family, right? Mm-hmm. And how, what was the journey of those families?
Yeah, so I think so adoption disruption. Like the more you delve into the adoption world, you'll come across it. And I think from an outside perspective, it can get judged quite harshly of, well, goodness, it's like you're taking the kid back, like, oh, it didn't work out. So, you're giving the child back. And I think especially people that haven't walked through adoption, or people that have maybe walked through an easier adoption, can be very harsh and judgmental to those families. And I think I was that way too, because prior to even maybe being on this journey of like, how can you just give up? And I think I always want to be careful too, because like anything, I mean, like you kind of look at marriage, because people make that comparison to marriage is like, well, God said not to divorce, right, but Christians divorce. Right. And so, but then you can't just broad stroke divorce, because we can look at the reasons for divorce, right? Is it like they fell out of love with each other, right? It just wasn't working out. Was there infidelity? I mean, there's so many reasons why people divorce. And so I don't feel like we can ever broad stroke it and just say like, it's all the same. And I think that's the same with adoption, is that, and the two stories that I highlight in the book, I think what both families came to realize is that no one was healthy in the family anymore. Like they had overestimated their ability to deal with a child with a traumatic background. And in one of the families, they had another adopted child in the home, and who had only been home, I think, for a year or so at the time when they brought home the second daughter. And what they saw was like the two girls, like trauma together was just like spiraling each other out of control. Their other children in the home, like, were also just going inside themselves, shutting the family out. And the more counsel that they got, even from outside professional help, was, we don't feel like these two girls can heal together in your home. So theirs disrupted quite quickly. I think the new daughter, who was older than the younger daughter, had only been home, I feel like it was less, if I remember correctly, less than like 6 months that she was in their home. But they just really felt like the outside psychologist said, the sooner you can separate these two girls, the better. And so even though there was a lot of judgment of like, you had her for 6 months and she was placed in another family, they just had to go with the advice that they were being given of like, we can't help two children at the same time, and then they can rewind their tapes and say like, oh, we were probably very naive in what we thought we were able to do for two kids. And so that was part of my reason in telling that story too, of like, don't rush to, it's like, if you're parenting one child, maybe adding another adopted child at that moment isn't the best option, if you're trying to help two kids heal. And then the second one was also a very complex story of trauma and seeing how that was affecting other kids in the home. And I think that is a big thing to consider for families that are considering adoption, that have kids at home still, especially in those like formative, like elementary ages. The impact of bringing a kid who's experienced trauma is going to impact your children. I mean, there's no way around it. It is going to. And so I think you have to be willing to count those costs, to put things in place, right, to make sure your kids are protected, the new child is protected. I know I address in the book sexual abuse. There were several families I interviewed where the child that was brought into the home sexually abused other children that were already in the home. A couple instances, it was biological children in the home. A couple instances, it was other adopted children in the home. And nobody sets out for that to happen. Right. And I think for some of those families, there was naivety, like not realizing the extent of sexual abuse that can happen in orphanages. And, kids don't just unlearn behavior because you adopt them out, they're still dealing with that. And so that's how they act out. That's what they know. So I just always say it's like better to be so aware of all the things that could happen so that you have the protections, in place, that like you don't room kids together, that where the door is going to be closed and parents aren't there, because you honestly, you just don't know. And so, what are all the protections that you can put in place if your family is called to this? Because I still believe families, even in spite of those risks, families will be called to take that. Just because there's risk doesn't mean you don't do something. But how do you go in knowing that just because God has called you to something, it doesn't mean like you're now protected from all the negative things that could happen, which I think is sometimes the Christians, we can operate with that. I remember some families just saying like, well, God's called us to this. So if like our kids aren't, of course this wouldn't happen to our kids, like God's going to protect them. And it's like, okay, yes, God is with you, but like there is an enemy that is also at work in this situation. And you have to be so aware of that. Cause, it's a spiritual warfare. I really believe that you are bringing into your home, and you have to have the tools to be able to fight that.
Yeah. But even I think it's important then to know, as you said, God is still with you, even if the bad stuff does happen, not to feel as parent guilty or, how could we not see it, but then to say, okay, Lord, what do we do now? How can we take it from here? And then the Lord, I'm sure, will give the grace and the resources and the ideas to deal with those things. And I think that's always so, important not to give up, but to work through it. And so in your experience, Karen, what would you say if there are families, they're considering adoption? Are there certain points that you would advise them? So for example, they already have biological children. Should they stick to the birth order, only adopt younger ones? Or because I know a lot of the families you interviewed, they sometimes adopted like a sandwich child in between. And it was, there was a big variety of adoption. What are just the things that you picked up over the years where you maybe can, give some advice?
Yeah. And this is such a hard, like, I think, especially as believers, like as a Christian, you add this, like, what is God, what is the Holy Spirit leading you to do? Because a lot of the families that I interviewed, had met their child prior, right? So it was like either they had hosted them through a hosting program that brought kids over for the summer, or they'd maybe gone on a mission trip and met a child that way. So it was like there was an attachment to a child that didn't fit in the birth order, right, naturally. So it's like it disrupted the order in the family. But it was like, well, God clearly has, called us to this child. So they kind of, I always say, like, that trumps, right, what research shows. And so that's why I always say it's this like delicate balance of like, what does research show from just like practical experience? And that says, don't disrupt the birth order, right? Try to like stack children to the bottom, right? If your kids are that age, not twinning children, right? So not adopting a child that's the same age of a child that you already have in your home. So there's all of that, right? And then again, being aware of age trauma issues or attachment issues. So it's like, you want to do all that research, but then like at the same time, it's like, if you research it to death, like you're going to find a million reasons, like, right, why you shouldn't do it. So then that's where I just feel like it's like being so aware of like what happens, what statistics show, what other families have experienced, right? And that research is there for a reason. And then asking God to really lead your family, right? And to just ask for his confirmation, because I can't imagine doing it without that. But at the same time, so it's like, talk to other families. I would say, do your own interviews, right? Like, talk to families who have done it and find out, like, what would they have done differently? How did it work if they did disrupt the birth order? Because I know, and I'm not sure like across Europe what the foster care system looks like, but in the US with foster care, I know a lot of believing friends who want to do foster care, and that usually involves like bringing in a child that's around their children's age. So, and those kids, I mean, the reality is there's, so many children in need of placement. So if we only follow the rules, of stick child here, like, we'll never find enough homes for children. So that's why I'm like, I'm not a hard and fast follow the way it has to be, but there's still a lot of wisdom that needs to be exercised. If you're doing it outside, like what's recommended, then what do you need to be very aware of? Where do you need to be proactive to protect children and I think kind of bringing up the already having children in the home is really giving those children a chance to express what they're feeling too. Cause I think a lot of children felt like they couldn't share how they were feeling. And there's so many emotions to process, just like a parent is processing how their family has changed after bringing a new child home. A child is processing that too. It's like, oh, our family dynamic has forever changed, and they might not have the words to process that. And they're dealing with a lot of grief and loss of like, oh, we added this child and now there's a lot of chaos because this child is, has some behavioral issues or, says things that we wouldn't normally say, so it's like really having to process that of like the whole family has shifted. And so you have to be very aware of like, how are you going to process those changes that have happened? I mean, every time a mother has a new child, that adds some dynamics of family shift, but I think it's a whole other dynamic when you're adopting an older child to the family mix.
Yeah, that's so good. And so what would you say? Because I think adoption is so close to God's heart. I mean, the scriptures, are full of he's the father to the fatherless, and also how we should treat orphans and widows. But I think probably not everybody feels called to adopt. But I do believe as the body of Christ, we can always support orphans or support the families who choose adoption or foster care. So what are the things that you've seen that we can do as the body of Christ to help orphans and those families?
Yeah, I think, in every context, in every country, it's going to be a little different too. I think for one, if you know an adoptive or foster family, then ask what you can do for them. I mean, whether it's respite care, which would mean, watching the kids so that they can get a break, just helping out with childcare, because I think it can be overwhelming for families at times, or asking them about a financial need that they might have. I mean, like that's a definite, practical way to get involved. And then in terms of supporting kids, depending on where you live, there's so many kids that have either aged out of the system or are older, and they, might not ever be adopted, but having just a positive adult role model in their life is going to be huge. I am single. I have not adopted, but there's a young woman in Ukraine that I've known since she was 15 in the orphanage, and she was never legally free for adoption because of her parent situation. But I have, stayed close friends with her and really discipled her and mentored her ever since she was 16, 17. And she's come to know the Lord through that time. She's 22 now. I'm somebody for her that just knows that she can call me at any time. And I regularly check in with her because she doesn't have a parental figure in her life. Yeah. So I think, how do we come alongside young people that need a positive believer in their life to just be a coach or a mentor? And I think that goes for kids that were either raised in an orphanage or just don't have a solid parental figures in their life. There's so much research about kids that do well, vulnerable kids that do well in life. It's because they had a positive adult figure in their life that walked with them. And so I think it's like, allow God to highlight for you who's somebody in your community, a young person, a kid who's struggling because they don't have an adult in their life. So you might not ever formally adopt this child, but they might know they always have a place at your holiday table, right? Or they might always know that you're going to celebrate their birthday with them. And those two things right there, holidays and birthdays, that they would know without a doubt, I can always go to this family to celebrate, right? That's huge. So I think that's a real practical way that people could be involved without ever having to formally, adopt a child.
Yeah, that's so good. Great. And what are some resources that you would recommend if people want to just inform themselves more?
On just adoption in general, or?
Yeah, just adoption.
Yeah. Well, my book, right? No, just
yes, of course. And we will put this in the link below so everyone can buy that.
I think, well, first of all, I think it's great to go to your own church or congregation and see what is your church or congregation doing to support adoptive families, and find out, because I think that's a great place to start, is what is the church have a ministry, or are they reaching out? Because I think there are a lot of churches that have solid adoption and foster ministries, and there's others that don't. And that's a real gap of how are we caring for the fatherless and the vulnerable in our community? In terms of books, there's a great book called The Connected Child by Dr. Karen Purvis. And that deals a lot with early attachment issues, that sort of thing. There's also a great book, not written by a Christian author, but it's called The Primal Wound. I'm blanking on the author's name right now, but that deals a lot with just that. Yeah, it's that early childhood trauma. And I think it really understands, because I think sometimes we can minimize, especially for younger adoption. Sometimes we think oh, you adopted as a baby, the child as a baby, they won't have any issues. But this book really deals with separation at birth from the mother that they grew inside of. That is what's called the primal wound, right? That separation. And a lot of attachment issues stem from that. So even if you adopt a baby at birth, some people think, well, I adopted the baby at birth, why are we still struggling with issues, right? I've raised this child. And so that kind of deals with some of that. But in terms of adoption, I think picking people's brains and talking to a wide variety of families. And I think the key there is wide variety of families, because just like anything in life, everyone's going to have their own experience, and that's going to color how they see a topic. And so you might talk to one person who had an amazing adoption experience and everybody should do it. And so you're whoa, yes, that's us. Or you might talk to somebody who had a horrible experience in adoption, really destroyed parts of their family dynamics, and they're still recovering from trauma, their family experience. So it's if you talk to either one, you're going to walk away with oh, I'm going to do that, or never going to do that. So that's why I think it's so good to talk to a lot of people and get a lot of experiences, so that you can really weigh and see this can go so many different ways, but what does it mean to have God at the center of it? And I think that's really what I've learned, more than anything, is we will suffer in this life, one way or another, whether it's by things we've chosen to do for God, or whether it's our own sin that causes suffering, right? There's we're going to suffer. And I think it's what do we do with that suffering, and how do we keep looking to God? And I think the families that kept their eyes on God, even in the midst of their challenges, and didn't become bitter, those were the families that I learned the most from, because I saw how they were so rooted in what does God want to teach me through these really difficult moments? Because we all have things that, we need to unlearn or learn, about God. And so I think those stories, were the ones that I learned definitely the most from.
Yeah. And also, I think we mustn't forget, what it does to the child, because even though there is maybe a lot of struggle and tension with the child that has been adopted, actually, I do believe something will change in the child, and because they had a family who loved them. And so what would you say, you have seen a lot of those struggles, but why are you still so for adoption? And what have you seen, just the hope that comes out of it? Maybe even if you don't always see the finished product. Maybe it's not always the child turns, I don't know, 25 and is a total stable, healthy adult. Often they still have issues they have to deal with because of their past. But why are you still so for adoption and putting children in families?
Yeah, I think it just goes back to like, because we were meant to be in family, even as messy and broken as it can be. And there's a quote, I can't remember who said it. I put it in the book, but it's just this whole concept of like, we're wounded in relationship, but we're healed in relationship. And I think it's like, that ultimately is what you hope, right? Kids can experience. And like you said, you don't always see it, right? Sometimes like there's more wounding that happens in the adoptive home, or something's interpreted as that. And so it's like, but we never stop, like a life without relationship. It's like, well, what kind of life is that? And so I think it's just like, I really believe God meant us to be in relationship. And that's where we can experience his healing is through the body of Christ. And so however a family can help a child get on that trajectory towards healing. And, again, it's like God designed the family. I mean, if we look at just like all of societal problems in general, like it really starts with the breakdown of the family. And I think that's what's so hard is we see brokenness. And, when you see so many of the ills of society, you realize like so much was, wounding and things that happened in childhood and then how that like happened in adulthood. And so again, I've never thought that, adoption, where was I going with that? Well, just the whole thought of like, God meant for us to be in relationship, but the enemy is like trying to destroy that. Right. And so it's like, the enemy wants families to implode, right? But God wants families to be a place of healing and growth. And so I think that's what it comes down to is like, because I believe God designed family, and he designed us to have the spiritual covering of a mother and a father. And the enemy has done his best to destroy that. And we're called to fight against that, right? To bring restoration to the family, because that's ultimately right where we can then disciple from there is like, if we can be healed and whole, we can then lead other people to health and healing as well. So I think, so to answer that question, I think it's just God designed family. So for better or worse, brokenness or not, I think we're to war against that brokenness and try to bring healing to families. Yeah,
that's so good. And while you were speaking, Karen, I was reminded of what it says in Corinthians, love never fails. Love never gives up. And actually, as parents, this is what we're called to do. To our biological children or our adopted children, we always, we persevere. As you said earlier, we just show up, every morning, we get out of bed, we make them breakfast. It's kind of like the task as a parent, the lifelong calling that we have to just pour love into the children. And God's word promises love never fails. And maybe sometimes that looks different than we thought it would look like. And maybe sometimes, the timing is very different. Maybe it's like 40 years down the road, then the change comes. But, we don't give up. We're persistent and we keep going. And I think that really is something only God can do in our lives to give us the grace and strength to be consistent and to show up every single day. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything else you would like to say or, pass on to people?
Yeah, no, I mean, again, it's just, there's so many stories that I heard where, like it's just to prayerfully consider to not, I remember there were so many stories of like where the wife really wanted to adopt and the husband wasn't on board. And so, I would even in those situations, like caution, like don't run ahead of God, like don't try to run ahead of God. And so in those
have to be in this together, right?
Yeah, together, because it's only going to get harder, right?
Yeah,
so you don't want to be pulling. You don't want to
marriage, and you
don't want to be pulling a reluctant spouse or reluctant children behind you. And so I would say, if you really feel like God's called it to you, then it's like submit it to the Lord and and pray. And I've definitely seen, some of those situations resolve where God really does speak to the other spouse or really does speak to the other children in the home. Like, yes, our family is supposed to do this. And there's such beauty in that when everybody is on the same page. But other families where you saw a more reluctant spouse and you're just like, oh goodness, this is going to be hard, because in those moments of challenge, it's like, you don't want the, I told you so, like, oh, see, we shouldn't have done this. Like, it was really hard. And so I would just say to pursue unity and to trust God's timing. And so if you have a passion to adopt, right, that's your calling, but your spouse isn't on board with you, or life is preventing you, then still pursue those other things, right, that I talked about, are like, what are other ways that you can contribute? And I definitely saw that in some families. It's like a wife maybe had the desire to adopt for years, and it hadn't been, her husband wasn't on board. So she found other ways to contribute and to get involved. And then God did change the husband's heart. And then I'm aware of other friends where, like, one of the spouses has had that on their heart and the other spouse still isn't on board. And they've just said, okay, like, I can't, like, I have this desire. God hasn't given that desire to my husband, but like, I can't do anything I can't change his heart. And so, so to find peace in that too, right? Because I think that's important. So I would just say that to anyone listening, that maybe it's on your heart and your spouse isn't with you yet, like, pray, keep praying and allow God to work, but be okay with the no too. And what are other ways that you can get involved and support and advocate and come alongside a kid in need? Because God knows there's so many people out there that need just a caring adult to walk through life with them. Yeah.
And as you said, I think even, the meal per week, maybe you can invite a young adult over for one evening and just, have fellowship with them. And I think we sometimes underestimate what we can do with relationships. Of course, adopting a child, you have so much more time and it's so much more intentional. But even just to kind of come alongside somebody, as you said, it can really influence and change people's lives.
And just to add to that too, I think the organicness of that too, of like a relationship developing naturally, instead of like, because I think of like, sometimes you think you adopt a child you don't know very well, and then it's like, boom, we're family. And now we're trying to like form a relationship. Yeah. There's just a quick example that comes to mind. There was a couple in Ukraine who they had started hosting a boy from the orphanage. I think he was 12 or 13 at the time. And they would just take him on holidays because the church had developed a program where like they would take kids out of the orphanage for the holidays. And so for like 2 years, they took this boy out on the holidays, never had the intention, like they didn't want to adopt. They had a small house, low income, but they just kept taking him. And well, like 2 years went by of taking him on holidays. And like, I mean, they had developed a relationship with this young man. And I think they just realized, well, we love him. Like, we want to support him. Like, why wouldn't we adopt him? Right. So then they did formally adopt this boy at like, I think he was like 15, wow. But they had been hosting him for a couple of years just on holidays and some, I think, summer breaks, but just the naturalness of like, had they just gone out to adopt him, like, would that have happened the same way? I don't know. But God, right through that relationship, changed both of their hearts to adopting an older child, which they never would have considered before. So I just think about that, like God, works with us slowly sometimes, right? As we develop a heart for a person, instead of just like, oh, we're going to adopt a child. So boom, we added a child to our family. So I think that's another thing just to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, that's so good. Thanks so much, Karen, for all your wisdom. And it was just brilliant.
I hope you guys found that really helpful. Please share it with anyone that you might think will benefit from that. And I'll see you in the next episode.